The wind came first as a whisper, a cold breath against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin. Then it began to moan, a low, mournful sound that slid through the Grays River Range and settled over the valley like a shroud. By the third day, it was screaming. It was a physical thing, a solid wall of sound and ice that scoured the Wyoming territory, erasing the world until nothing was left but the fury of the storm and the shivering girl inside the one-room cabin. Elsie was 16. She felt 100. She sat huddled on a thin corn husk mattress, a threadbare blanket pulled up to her chin, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The fire in the stone hearth had dwindled to a few defiant embers, sullen red eyes blinking in a bed of gray ash. The last of the wood pile, a small stack of splintered pine that Malcolm had deemed sufficient, was gone. Cold was a patient predator. It had crept through the chinks in the walls, seeped up through the floorboards, and was now wrapping its fingers around her bones. "You will stay here and think about obedience." Malcolm's words echoed in the howl of the wind. They had been delivered 5 days ago, his voice as flat and hard as the frozen earth outside. His shadow had filled the small cabin, smelling of whiskey and horses and a cold rage that was always simmering just beneath the surface. Her crime had been a dropped plate. It had shattered on the floor. And, for a moment, the sound had been louder than the wind. He had not struck her then. His cruelty was often more creative. He had looked down at her, a girl barely a woman, his eyes passing over her as if she were a disobedient hound. He had gathered his winter gear, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He would ride out to the winter pastures. He'd said, check on the herd. He would be back when he decided she had learned her lesson. He had left her with a half-empty sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, and the silence. The flour was gone. The pork, carved into slivers so thin they were transparent, had vanished 2 days ago. Now, hunger was a dull, constant ache in the pit of her stomach. It was a familiar ache, back home. Before this, hunger had been a frequent visitor. Her father, a man broken by a bad harvest and a worse gamble, had looked at her not with love, but with the weary eyes of a man calculating his assets. Elsie had been his last coin. He had sold her into this marriage to pay off his debts to Malcolm, a man nearly twice her age with a reputation for a heavy hand and a short temper. "He is a good provider." "Elsie," her father had said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "He has land. You will not want for anything." He had been wrong. She wanted for everything. She wanted for her mother, taken by fever 3 winters past, her warm hands and soft lullabies now a fading dream. She wanted for her 2 younger brothers, farmed out to distant relatives she had never met, their faces blurring in her memory. She wanted for a kind word, a gentle touch, a moment of peace that was not simply the quiet before a storm. She pushed herself off the mattress, her joints protesting with a dull ache. The cold was making her slow, her thoughts thick as molasses. She moved to the cabin's single window, its pane clouded with a delicate lacework of frost. She scraped a small, clear patch with a fingernail and peered out. The world was an endless, churning sea of white. The trees were skeletal ghosts, weighted down with snow. The path to the privy was gone. The mountains were gone. The sky was gone. There was only the storm, a white monster swallowing everything. Malcolm had not returned. The thought brought both a sliver of terror and a larger, guiltier wave of relief. He could be dead out there, frozen in a drift, his horse fallen beside him, and she would be free. But freedom would mean starving to death in this box he called a home, miles from any town, any road, any soul. The days had bled into one another, marked only by the meager light that filtered through the frosted window. She spent the hours in a daze, moving from the mattress to the window and back again. She rationed the last of the water in the bucket, sipping it slowly, feeling the icy liquid trickle down her throat. She thought of Malcolm's return. He would be angry that the wood was gone. He would be angry that she had not found a way to be useful. His anger was a living thing, a coiled snake in the corner of the room, always waiting to strike. She had learned to move silently, to make herself small, to anticipate his moods like a farmer anticipates the weather. But his weather was all thunder and lightning, with no promise of a clear sky. It was on the evening of the 5th day, as twilight bled into a deep, bruised purple and the wind's howl deepened its pitch, that she heard it. At first, it was just another sound in the storm's symphony, a rhythmic thudding lost in the shriek of the wind. She dismissed it. An animal, perhaps, a branch falling from a snow-laden tree. But the sound persisted, growing steadily stronger, more defined. It was the sound of a horse moving slowly, deliberately, fighting its way through the deep snow. Her heart leaped into her throat. A frantic, trapped bird. Malcolm! He was back. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of hunger and exhaustion. She scrambled backward, away from the door, her eyes wide in the gloom. He would be half frozen and full of rage. He would blame her for the storm, for his hardship, for the cold hearth that awaited him. Her mind flashed with images of his face, tight with fury. His hand raised. Her eyes darted around the small, shadowy room. There was nowhere to hide. Her gaze fell upon the hearth. Next to the pile of cold ashes lay a small, rusted knife, used for skinning rabbits and whittling kindling. It was a poor weapon, the blade dull, the handle loose. But it was something. It was all she had. She grabbed it, the cold metal shocking her skin. Her hand was trembling so violently she could barely hold it. The horse was closer now, its labored breathing audible even over the wind. Then, the sound of its hooves stopped directly outside the cabin. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the gale. She held her breath, listening. The knife held tight in her fist, its point aimed at the door. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to fight or to flee, though there was nowhere to run. A heavy thud against the wooden door made her jump, a small cry escaping her lips. It was not the sound of a fist. It was the sound of a body slumping against the wood. A moment passed. Then, a voice, rough and cracked, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "Please, shelter." It was not Malcolm's voice. Her mind reeled. A stranger. Out here, in this storm. It could be anyone. A bandit, a drifter, a man far more dangerous than her husband. Her instincts screamed at her to stay quiet, to pretend the cabin was empty, abandoned, to wait for him to move on or freeze. Another, weaker thud against the door. A groan of pain. "Horse is down. Lost." The voice was ragged with desperation. She pictured a man freezing to death just a few feet away from her, his life seeping away into the snow. Her mother's voice, a faint echo from a lifetime ago, whispered in her memory. "You never turn away a soul in need. Elsie, the good Lord watches." But the good Lord was not here. Malcolm was not here. Only she was here. A 16-year-old girl with a rusted knife and a paralyzing fear of men. She crept toward the door, her stockinged feet silent on the rough floorboards. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening. She could hear ragged, shallow breathing on the other side. He was still there. He was alone. The horse was down. He'd said. Her hand, still gripping the knife, moved to the heavy wooden bar that secured the door. It was a terrible choice. Let him in and risk the devil you do not know. Leave him out and let a man die on your doorstep, his ghost to haunt the cabin forever. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she slowly, carefully, lifted the bar. The wind tore at the door, trying to rip it from her grasp. She opened it just a crack, peering into the swirling maelstrom of snow. A figure was slumped against the frame, a dark shape against the blinding white. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but bent with exhaustion. Snow caked his hat, his coat, his beard. He lifted his head slowly, and in the sliver of dying light, she saw his face. It was chapped raw by the wind, his lips blue, But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, hollowed out, filled with a profound weariness that seemed to go beyond the storm. He was not old, perhaps 10 years her senior, but he looked as if he had lived 1,000 years of hardship. He tried to speak again, but only a dry cough came out. He swayed on his feet, and for a moment, she thought he would collapse into the snow. Her decision was not a conscious one. It was an impulse, a flicker of the girl she had been before Malcolm, before her father's desperation had sealed her fate. She pulled the door open wider. "Come in," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. He practically fell inside, stumbling over the threshold. He caught himself on the wall, one hand pressed against the logs for support. He was limping badly, dragging one leg behind him. He pushed the door shut against the raging storm. The sound of the wind instantly muffled, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Then he slid the heavy wooden bar back into place, securing them inside. The silence that followed was immense, heavy with unspoken fears and suspicions. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cold leather, and the man's exhaustion. He stood leaning against the door, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She remained by the hearth, the knife still clutched in her hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt. They were two statues in the gloom, two wary animals forced into the same den by the storm. He made no move toward her. After a long moment, he slowly, painfully, pushed himself away from the door and hobbled toward the center of the room. He moved with a practiced economy, as if every motion cost him dearly. He was a cowboy. That much was clear from his worn chaps and sturdy boots, now caked with ice. But there was something else about him, a stillness, a grim set to his jaw that spoke of more than just a life spent on the range. It spoke of discipline and of pain. He finally looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her small frame, the threadbare dress, the fear in her eyes. He saw the empty shelves, the cold hearth. His expression did not change, but a flicker of understanding seemed to pass through his dark eyes. He was polite, though his voice was a low rasp. "Ma'am," he said, the word sounding foreign in the small cabin. He made a move to take off his hat, a gesture of ingrained respect, but his arms seemed too heavy to lift. He let it fall back to his side. "My apologies for the intrusion. My name is Cole. I was moving a small herd north, got caught in this blow. My horse, she gave out a mile back." Elsie just nodded, unable to find her voice. She watched him, her knuckles white around the handle of the knife. He was carrying the weight of something heavy. And it was not just the cold and the exhaustion. It was a deep, settled sorrow that clung to him like the snow on his coat. He did not press her for her name or her story. He seemed to accept the situation for what it was. Two strangers, trapped by a blizzard, bound by a temporary and fragile truce. His gaze drifted to the water bucket near the hearth. It was almost empty. The sight of his thirst, so plain on his cracked lips, broke through her fear. It was a simple, human need. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. She scooped a dipper of water from the bucket and held it out to him. Her hand trembled, and a little of the water sloshed over the side. He took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The touch was impersonal, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. It was a touch without anger, without demand. It was just warmth against her cold skin. He drank the water in long, slow swallows, his throat working. He drained the dipper and handed it back to her, his eyes meeting hers for a second time. "Thank you," he murmured. He made his way to the hearth and sank to the floor with a quiet groan. His bad leg stretched out before him. He leaned his back against the cold stones, pulled his hat down over his eyes, and seemed to shrink into himself. The energy that had gotten him through the door was gone. The storm had taken its last ounce of strength. Elsie retreated to her mattress in the corner, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders. She watched him, her fear warring with a strange and unwelcome flicker of pity. He was just a man, lost and half-frozen. He had been polite. He had not threatened her. The minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds were the howl of the wind outside and the man's slow, steady breathing as he surrendered to a deep, exhausted sleep. He slumped sideways, his head resting on his arm, as vulnerable as a child. She sat and watched him, this stranger who had stumbled out of the storm and into her prison, in the faint, dying glow of the embers. She could see the lines of hardship etched on his face, a scar that ran along his jawline, the worn leather of his gun belt. He had seen trouble. He knew its face intimately. Her gaze, which had been fixed on the sleeping man, drifted slowly across the room. It moved past the empty shelves, past the cold hearth, and settled on the door. Her breath caught in her chest. The heavy wooden bar was slid firmly into its iron brackets. He had locked it behind him when he came in. The simple, practical act, meant to keep the raging storm at bay, twisted in her mind. It was the same sound, the same final thud, that Malcolm made when he barred the door at night. It was the sound of a cage being locked. The stranger was asleep, helpless by her fire, but the door was locked. The cold in the room was no longer just from the winter outside. It was a deep, chilling dread that settled in her heart. She was trapped with the storm, trapped with her hunger, and now, trapped with him. Cole woke to a world of gray light and silence. The wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a profound quiet that felt heavier than the storm's roar. For a moment, he did not know where he was. The scent of cold ash and pine, the unfamiliar weight of the silence, the deep, biting ache in his bones and his leg, it all settled on him at once. He remembered the blizzard, the fall of his mare, Sarah, the desperate, stumbling walk through a white hell, and the girl. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his body groaning in protest. Across the small room, she was already awake, a wraith in the half-light. She knelt before the hearth, feeding the last few splinters of wood to a tiny, struggling flame. A small pot sat over it, steam rising in a thin, lazy curl. She was melting snow for water. He watched her, unseen. Her movements were slow, conserving an energy she barely possessed. The gray light was merciless, hollowing out the shadows beneath her eyes and cheekbones. Her dress, a faded calico, hung on a frame that was all sharp angles and delicate lines. She was young, younger than he had first thought in the storm's chaos, and she was starving. A dull anger stirred in his gut, an old, familiar feeling. It was not aimed at her, but at the world that could leave a child so utterly abandoned. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he got to his feet. She flinched, her head snapping up, her eyes wide with the familiar terror of a cornered animal. The rusted knife he had seen the night before was on the floor beside her, her hand instinctively moving toward it. "Easy," he said, his voice a low gravel. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace he had learned long ago was more for his own benefit than for others. It was a reminder to himself to be slow, to be careful. She did not relax, but her hand stilled. She watched him as he hobbled to the door, his bad leg a fiery protest with every step. He lifted the heavy bar, the wood smooth and cold beneath his fingers, and pushed the door open. The cold that flooded the cabin was sharp and clean, a physical shock that stole the breath. Outside, the world was remade. The snow lay in massive, sculpted drifts, burying the landscape in a blanket of impossible white. The sky was the color of lead, promising more snow to come, but for now, there was a fragile peace. He scanned the area. His eyes narrowed. He saw the small, dilapidated shed, the snow-covered shape that might be a woodpile, and beyond that, nothing but the endless silent forest. He turned back to her. "Is there an axe?" She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a small, jerky nod toward the shed. Without another word, He stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The cold was a brutal slap, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head, sharpened the edges of his grief. He found the axe in the shed, its handle worn smooth, its head pitted with rust. It was dull, but it would have to do. The work was a kind of prayer. He fought his way to the woodpile, the deep snow sucking at his boots, his bad legs screaming. He unearthed a few frozen logs and set to splitting them. Each swing of the axe was a grunt of effort, a release of the tension coiled tight in his shoulders, the rhythmic shock of the blade biting into wood, the clean crack of a log splitting, the spray of frozen chips. It was a simple, honest language he understood. He did not think of the cold, or his hunger, or the girl watching him from the cabin door. He thought of nothing. For a time, there was only the axe, the wood, and the burn in his muscles. But the past was a stubborn ghost. It rose unbidden with the rhythm of his work. The crack of the axe became the crack of a rifle. The clean scent of pine became the foul stench of mud and gunpowder. He was 22 again, not 28. He was in a Tennessee thicket, the air thick with the screams of men and the whine of lead. He was looking for his brother, Liam, 17 years old, with a face that had not yet learned how to shave properly and eyes that still held the light of a boy who believed in glory. Their father had been against it, but Liam had been full of fire and stories of honor. Cole, older and already weary from 2 years of fighting, had promised to watch over him. "Stay close, Liam!" he had yelled over the din. "Stay down!" But Liam had stood up. Just for a second. His eyes were wide with a terrible, thrilling excitement. He had raised his rifle, a silhouette against a flash of cannon fire. "Cole, I see them, I see." The sound the bullet made when it hit was small, a wet little pop that was almost lost in the chaos. Liam had folded, not with a cry, but with a quiet sigh, as if he were merely tired. Cole had scrambled to him, ignoring the bullets that sang past his ears. He had held his brother, feeling the boy's life pour out into the mud, hot and sticky on his hands. Liam's eyes, wide with surprise, had looked up at him. "I'm sorry, Cole," he had whispered, a promise broken, a life spent. And it was his fault. He should have been faster. He should have held him down. He should have never let him enlist. The axe handle slipped in his sweaty palm. The log skittered away, unbroken. Cole stopped, leaning on the axe, his chest heaving. He squeezed his eyes shut. But the image of Liam's face remained, burned onto the back of his eyelids. The guilt was a physical thing, a stone in his gut that he had carried every day for 6 years. It was why he drifted, why he kept moving. He was running from a ghost he knew he could never outrun. He gathered an armload of the split wood and carried it back to the cabin. His face was a grim mask, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Elsie had retreated from the doorway when he approached. She watched as he built up the fire, his movements efficient and sure. The flames caught, grew, and began to throw a real, living warmth into the cabin. The oppressive cold began a slow retreat. She had spent the time he was outside not watching him, but working. His coat, a heavy wool garment that had been torn at the shoulder, lay across her lap. With a needle and thread she had taken from a small sewing box, she was mitching the fabric together with small, neat stitches. It was a quiet, focused task, her head bent, her fingers moving with a practiced grace. He sat on the floor by the fire, the heat slowly seeping into his frozen limbs. He did not speak. She did not look up from her work. They shared the small space, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the needle through wool. It was a strange sort of domesticity, an unspoken agreement forged in the crucible of the storm. He provided the warmth. She mended what was broken. Hours passed. The gray light outside began to fade once more. Cole had managed to retrieve his saddlebags from his dead horse, a grim journey that left him exhausted and his heart heavy. Sarah had been a good horse. He had found a few strips of dried venison and a half-full tin of coffee. It was not much, but it was more than they'd had. He boiled the coffee and shared it with her in a chipped tin cup. She took it with both hands, her fingers wrapping around it as if for dear life. The warmth seemed to loosen something in her. "My name is Elsie," she said, her voice quiet, barely disturbing the air. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the guarded hope in her eyes, the simple human need to be known. "Cole," he answered, though he knew she had heard him say it before. She took a sip of the coffee. The bitter, hot liquid, a small shock of life. She seemed to be gathering her courage. This is my husband's cabin?" He just nodded, waiting. "He is a rancher, Malcolm." She said the name as if it were a stone in her mouth. "He is away, checking on the herd." Cole heard the words she said, but he also heard the vast, empty spaces between them. He heard the hesitation, the careful selection of each phrase. He saw the way her eyes would not quite meet his, the way her shoulders were permanently hunched, as if expecting a blow. He had seen that look before, in frightened horses and in broken men. He did not need to know the details. The story was written all over her, in the bruises he glimpsed on her wrist when her sleeve slid back, in the pervasive terror that clung to her like a second skin. He knew she was trapped, young and afraid beyond measure. He felt the familiar, dangerous urge to protect her, an instinct he had tried to bury with his brother. He did not press her. He did not ask when Malcolm was due to return, or why he would leave his young wife alone in a remote cabin with winter closing in. To ask the questions would be a cruelty, forcing her to either lie or to speak a truth too terrible for a stranger's ears. So he just nodded again and turned his gaze back to the fire. He would stay. He had known it the moment he woke and saw her by the dying embers. He would stay until the storm broke for good, and he would stay until he was sure she was safe. It was a foolish, reckless promise to make to himself, but it settled in his chest with the weight of a vow. The next 2 days passed in much the same way. A fragile rhythm was established. Cole hunted. His leg made it difficult, but he was a patient man. He set snares and managed to catch 2 rabbits, a meager feast that tasted like a banquet. Elsie cooked them, making a thin, watery stew that they ate in silence. He chopped wood, reinforcing the dwindling pile until it was a formidable wall against the cold. She mended his clothes, washed their few dishes, and kept the fire going. The tension between them was a constant, living presence. It was in the way he was careful to never brush against her in the small cabin, the way he would move to the other side of the room when she drew near. It was a deliberate distance, a shield he put up. He was protective of her, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line when he was outside, his hand never far from the worn pistol at his hip. But he was distant, a man locked inside his own private prison of grief. For her part, Elsie found herself watching him constantly. She was drawn to his quiet strength, the way he moved with a purpose that was entirely foreign to her. Malcolm was all bluster and loud, violent motion. Cole was silence and competence. He had not offered a single word of comfort, yet his very presence was a comfort. He had asked for nothing, yet he had given her warmth, food, and a sense of safety she had not known since her mother died. She felt a tentative, dangerous gratitude blooming in her chest, but with it came a wave of shame so profound it made her feel dizzy. What right did she have to feel this way? She was a married woman. She was Malcolm's property. This quiet, grim man would see the truth of her eventually, and he would be disgusted. He would leave. The thought of being alone again was a cold knot of fear in her stomach. The storm returned on the 3rd night, weaker than before, but with a mournful wind that cried around the corners of the cabin. They sat by the fire, the rabbit stew finished, the silence stretching between them. Elsie knew the passes would be clearing soon. He would be able to leave. The question escaped her before she could stop it. a soft, desperate whisper.
"Will you stay?"
Cole did not look at her. He continued to stare into the flames, his profile etched in the firelight. The muscles in his jaw tightened. A long moment passed, filled only with the sound of the crackling logs and the moaning of the wind. He did not answer. His silence was not a refusal, but it was not a promise either. It was the honest answer of a man who knew the future was a treacherous country. In his silence, she heard all of his own ghosts, all of his own fears. She looked away, a fresh wave of shame washing over her for having asked, for having needed so much. Later, the cold woke her. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing coals, giving off a last, faint warmth. The wood he had stacked inside was gone, and the wind had driven the temperature down until the chill was a physical pain. She was shivering uncontrollably under her thin blanket. Across the room, she could hear the chatter of Cole's teeth. She watched him rise, a dark shadow in the gloom. He moved to the hearth and stared at the dying embers as if willing them back to life. He looked over at her, his face unreadable in the dark. "We'll freeze separate," he said, his voice low and practical. He took his own blanket and laid it out on the floor, as close to the hearth as he dared. He took her blanket and laid it beside his, overlapping them. It was not an invitation, but a command born of necessity, a means of survival. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. To lie so close to him felt like a transgression, a betrayal of a line they had so carefully drawn. But the cold was relentless, seeping into her marrow. With trembling limbs, she rose and went to the pallet he had made. She lay down stiffly on her blanket, her back to him, every muscle tensed. She felt the floorboard shift as he lay down behind her, a few inches of cold air separating them. The heat from his body was a shocking, powerful thing. It was a solid, living warmth that called to the shivering chill in her own bones. Despite herself, she trembled more violently, a deep, convulsive shudder that racked her entire body. It was the cold, but it was more than the cold. It was the fear, the loneliness, the shame, and the overwhelming, terrifying comfort of his presence. She felt him shift. He moved away from her, increasing the cold gap between them, deliberately putting space between his body and hers. He was trying not to touch her. He was trying to be honorable. But to her, in that moment, it felt like the ultimate rejection. It was the world turning its back on her one more time. And something inside her broke. The carefully constructed walls of silence and endurance she had built around her heart crumbled into dust. A sob, thick and ragged, tore from her throat. She turned over, her face streaked with tears in the faint ember glow. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, his face a mask of stone. "Please," she whispered, the word a shard of glass in her throat. The begging was not for a touch of passion, not for a lover's embrace. It was the raw, desperate plea of a drowning soul for a hand to hold. It was a plea for comfort, for a single moment of human warmth in a life that had been nothing but cold. Her voice cracked, breaking on the fragile edge of hope. "If I beg, will you stay?" He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark pools of a pain that mirrored her own. He saw the truth of her plea, the desperate, childlike need that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with survival. He did not speak. He did not move closer. He did not pull her into his arms, but he stopped pulling away. He held his place, a solid, unmoving presence in the dark. A long, shuddering breath left his body, and then he slowly, deliberately, turned his back to her. It was not a rejection. It was an answer. It was a shield. He was giving her his warmth, the solid barrier of his body against the cold and the dark, without the complication or threat of an embrace. He stayed. He lay there, his back to her, a silent guardian, and as Elsie finally drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. She could not see that in the darkness, His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. That night, and the nights that followed, marked a subtle shift in the cabin's geography. The invisible line that had divided the small room into his space and her space blurred. They still slept on separate blankets, but the bitter cold forced them to remain near the hearth, their pallets lying side by side. An unspoken truce was born in the shared vulnerability of the dark. His quiet, steady breathing became a comfort to her, a solid presence against the night's terrors. Her small, rustling movements as she slept were a reminder to him of the fragile life he was. For some reason he could not articulate, compelled to protect. The days fell into a rhythm, a silent dance of survival. The world outside remained a formidable wilderness of snow and ice, but inside the cabin, they carved out a pocket of order. Cole was a relentless worker, driven by a need to keep his hands and mind occupied. He rose before the first gray light, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would tend the fire, then venture out into the biting cold. He spent a full day on the roof, his bad leg braced against the slippery logs, patching the holes where the wind had torn away chunks of sod and mud. Elsie watched from below, her heart in her throat every time he slipped. Her hands clenched as she passed him the frozen mud mixed with water that served as mortar. She learned the exact moment he would need the tool, the precise angle to hand him the makeshift trowel. Not a word was exchanged, but the communication was perfect. He restocked the woodpile until it was a fortress, a bulwark against the enduring winter. He taught her, with hand gestures and quiet demonstrations, how to set the snares he fashioned from wire found in the shed. The first time she checked a line by herself and returned with a snowshoe hare, its body still warm. The look on her face was not of triumph, but of a solemn, terrible pride. She had provided, for the first time in her life. She had fed herself and another. Cole had simply nodded when she held it up, but she saw the flicker of approval in his eyes, and it warmed her more than the fire. They spoke little, but they learned each other in other ways. She learned the sound of his limp, a slight drag and scuff that told her how much pain he was in. She learned that he drank his coffee black and scalding hot, and that he stared into the fire for hours with a sadness so profound it seemed to have no bottom. He learned that she was terrified of sudden movements and loud noises, that she would flinch if he raised his hand too quickly to scratch his head. He learned that she had a quiet, stubborn strength, and that when she thought he was not looking, she would trace the patterns of the frost on the window pane with a look of childlike wonder. They were two ghosts haunting the same small house, each wrapped in their own shroud of the past. But slowly, tentatively, the edges of their solitudes began to touch. One evening, as she was adding water to the stew, he spoke without preamble, his voice low. "My brother, he was younger than you." Elsie froze, the dipper halfway to the pot. She looked at him. He was not looking at her, but into the flames, his face a mask of old grief. "He was taken in the war," Cole continued, the words rough, as if pulled from a deep, unhealed wound. "I was supposed to watch him. I failed." He said nothing more. He did not need to. Elsie understood. She saw the guilt he carried, a burden heavier than any winter pack. She said nothing in return, knowing that no words she could offer would be adequate. Instead, she finished preparing their meal and served him his portion first, a small, silent gesture of acknowledgement, of respect for his pain. In that shared, unspoken understanding, a new and delicate thread was woven between them. The intimacy that grew was a fragile, dangerous thing. It thrived in the quiet moments, in the space between heartbeats. It was there in the way he left the warmest spot by the fire for her, and in the way she mended a button on his shirt without being asked. It was a closeness born of proximity and dependence. Yet it was beginning to feel like something more, something that had a life of its own. One morning, she woke first. The light was pale, the color of pearl, and the cabin was still and cold. Cole was asleep. his face turned toward her. In sleep, the grim lines on his face softened. The weariness was still there, etched into the corners of his eyes and mouth. But the guard was down. He looked younger, more vulnerable. He looked like a man who had once been a boy. A powerful, aching tenderness rose in her chest. It was a feeling so foreign, so overwhelming. It made her breathless. He was the first person since her mother who had shown her any kindness, and his kindness was all the more profound for its silence. He had never offered a gentle word, but his actions were a testament to a deep, ingrained decency. He had fed her, kept her warm, protected her from the wilderness. He had asked for nothing in return. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand. She wanted to know if he was real. She needed to feel the solid truth of him. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, brushed against the rough stubble on his jaw. She traced the line of a faint scar that ran from his temple to his chin, a pale white line against his sun-weathered skin. She wondered what story it told. His reaction was instantaneous, a reflex forged in the fires of war. Before he was fully awake, his hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. His grip was like iron, his eyes flying open, wide and wild with alarm. For a single, terrifying second, he was not the quiet man who chopped her wood. He was a soldier, cornered and fighting for his life. She gasped, a small, choked sound of fear. The sight of her, the terror in her eyes, broke through his battle-honed instincts. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of self-loathing so intense it was a physical blow. He let go of her wrist as if her skin had burned him. He scrambled backward, away from her, putting distance between them. "I am sorry," he rasped, his voice thick with shame. "I did not mean—" But Elsie barely heard him. She was staring at her own wrist, where the pale imprints of his fingers were already beginning to bloom into red marks. It was not the grip that had frightened her. It was the familiarity of it. It was Malcolm's grip. But the release, that was something entirely new. Malcolm never let go. Cole got to his feet and turned away from her, unable to look at her, unable to face the fear he had put in her eyes. He had touched her with violence, the one thing he had sworn to himself he would never do. The fragile peace between them was shattered. The silence that fell was no longer comfortable. It was thick with shame and regret. The day was a misery of unspoken apologies and averted gazes. The rhythm was broken. They moved around each other like strangers. The small cabin suddenly a vast, empty space. Cole spent the entire day outside, splitting wood with a furious, desperate energy, trying to sweat out the shame. Elsie stayed inside, her hands idle for the first time in days, her mind a turmoil of confusion and a strange, aching sorrow. It was late in the afternoon when the sound came, the rhythmic crunch of a horse's hooves in the snow, steady and purposeful. But this was not the sound of a weary, half-dead animal. This was the sound of a strong horse, a horse that knew its destination. Cole heard it first. He stopped, the axe held motionless in his hand, his head lifted, his body going rigid. He looked toward the cabin, and his eyes met Elsie's through the open doorway. In that single, shared glance, the truth passed between them. It was over. Malcolm had returned. He appeared around the bend in the trail, a large, imposing figure on a powerful black horse. He was not frostbitten or weary. He was dressed in a thick buffalo coat, his face ruddy from the cold and from the whiskey that Elsie could smell even from a distance. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene, the massive, neatly stacked wood pile, the smoke curling from the chimney, the strange man standing in his yard holding his axe. And then his gaze found Elsie, standing in the doorway like a pale ghost. His face, which had been set in a neutral expression of a man returning home, darkened into a thunderous scowl. He dismounted, his movements heavy and deliberate. He pulled a rifle from the scabbard on his saddle. "Well, now," Malcolm's voice was a low, dangerous drawl, slurred with drink. "What do we have here? I leave for a few days, and my wife starts entertaining guests." He strode toward the cabin, his boots sinking into the snow. His eyes were fixed on Cole, filled with a possessive, murderous rage. "You, drifter, what are you doing on my land, with my wife?" Cole did not move. He let the axe drop to his side, his hand resting near its handle. His face was calm, but his eyes were watchful, cold as river stones. "I was caught in the storm," he said, his voice even. "Your wife gave me shelter. Nothing more." "My wife?" Malcolm laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My wife does what she is told, and I did not tell her to bring strange men into my home." He looked past Cole, his eyes pinning Elsie in the doorway. The look he gave her was filled with a venomous promise of pain. "You have been a disobedient girl. We will talk about this later." He turned his attention back to Cole. "I think you have overstayed your welcome. Get on your way before I decide to plant you where you stand." "I cannot do that," Cole said, his voice still quiet, but with an underlying edge of steel. "My horse is dead. The passes are still thick with snow." "That sounds like your problem, not mine," Malcolm sneered. He raised the rifle, its barrel pointing squarely at Cole's chest. "I will count to 3. In that moment, Elsie moved. She ran from the doorway and stood between them, her small body a fragile shield. "No!" she cried, her voice thin but clear. "He is telling the truth. He was lost. I let him in. He helped me. He kept me from freezing." Malcolm looked at her as if she were an insect. "Get back in the house, Elsie. This does not concern you." "It does," she insisted, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You left me here to die." The accusation hung in the frozen air. Malcolm's face went from anger to pure, incandescent rage. "You ungrateful!" He took a step toward her, his hand raised to strike. Cole moved faster than a man with a bad leg should be able to move. He lunged, not at Malcolm, but at the rifle. He grabbed the barrel and shoved it upward, the gun discharging with a deafening roar, the shot going wild into the gray sky. The fight was a chaotic, brutal explosion of violence. Malcolm was bigger and heavier, fueled by whiskey and rage. He swung the butt of the rifle, catching Cole on the side of the head. Cole staggered back, blood streaming from a cut on his temple. But Cole was faster, and he was fighting with a cold, desperate fury. He drove his shoulder into Malcolm's chest, sending them both crashing into the newly stacked woodpile. Logs scattered across the snow. They grappled in the snow, 2 animals locked in a primal struggle. It was not a clean fight. It was gouging, kicking, and raw, unrestrained violence. Malcolm got his hands around Cole's throat, his thumbs pressing down, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Cole's vision began to swim in a sea of black spots. With his last ounce of strength, he brought his knee up hard into Malcolm's groin. Malcolm screamed, his grip loosening. Cole scrambled away, gasping for air. He tried to get to his feet, but his bad leg gave out from under him. Malcolm, recovering, charged at him. He kicked Cole in the ribs, a vicious, solid blow that sent a blinding flash of pain through his body. He kicked him again. "I will kill you," Malcolm snarled, his face contorted. "I will kill you, and then I will deal with her." He turned and started back toward his rifle, which lay half buried in the snow. That was his mistake. It gave Cole the second he needed. He launched himself forward, tackling Malcolm around the legs, bringing him down. He landed a solid punch to Malcolm's jaw, then another. But the bigger man rolled, trapping Cole underneath him. He pinned Cole's arms and began to smash his head against the frozen, unforgiving ground. Elsie stood frozen for only a moment, a scream trapped in her throat. Then, a survival instinct she did not know she possessed took over. She ran to the woodpile, grabbed a heavy, split log, and ran at Malcolm's back, She swung it with all of her might, the wood connecting with his shoulder with a sickening thud. Malcolm roared in pain and surprise. Rolling off Cole, he turned to her, his eyes blazing with a fresh wave of fury. He started toward her, and in that moment, Elsie knew he was going to kill her. But Cole was on his feet. He had the axe. He did not raise it to strike. He held it in front of him, a clear and deadly warning. He was a terrifying sight, his face a bloody mask, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But his stance was unwavering. "Stay away from her," Cole said, his voice a low growl that was more animal than human. Malcolm looked from the axe to Cole's face, and for the first time, a flicker of fear, or perhaps just drunken caution, entered his eyes. He was injured. The drifter was armed and clearly willing to die. He spat a curse onto the snow. "This is not over," he seethed. "This is my land. She is my wife. You will both pay for this." He limped over to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and rode away without a backward glance, disappearing into the twilight. The silence he left behind was deafening. Cole stood for a long moment, swaying on his feet, before the axe slipped from his fingers. He collapsed to his knees, and then pitched forward into the snow. Elsie was at his side in an instant. She turned him over, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. His face was swollen and bruised. A deep gash on his forehead was bleeding freely, and his shirt was stained with blood from a cut on his side. He was breathing, but it was shallow and ragged. Somehow, she got him inside. She dragged him, half-carried him, her own small strength magnified by adrenaline and terror. She settled him on the floor by the fire, his head in her lap. She fetched the sewing kit and a bottle of whiskey Malcolm had left behind. Her hands were still trembling, but she worked with a feverish determination. She cleaned his wounds with whiskey-soaked rags, her own tears mingling with the blood on his face. He winced and groaned, but did not wake. The cut on his forehead was deep. It would need stitches. She had seen her mother do it once, on a farmhand who had tangled with a barbed wire fence. She threaded the needle, her stomach churning, crying softly. She leaned over him and pushed the needle through his skin. He flinched in his unconscious state, a low moan escaping his lips. She whispered apologies, her tears falling onto his bruised cheek. She made 3 clumsy, uneven stitches, pulling the skin together, her heart breaking with every push of the needle. As she worked, the words began to spill out of her, a torrent of truth that could no longer be contained. "He is not my husband," she whispered to his unhearing form, the confession a painful release. "Not really. My father, he sold me to pay a debt. I never wanted it." She finished the last stitch and cut the thread with her teeth. She moved to the gash on his side, her hands gentle as she cleaned it. "He forced me," she said, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "From the first night. He hurt me. He said it was my duty." She took a shuddering breath. "I have never been touched with kindness, not once, in my whole life, not until you—" The confession was absolute. It was the whole, ugly, and shameful truth of her existence. She had laid her soul bare to this broken man, and he had not even heard it. She finished bandaging his ribs, her tears spent, leaving her hollowed out and empty. Cole drifted in and out of consciousness through the night. Elsie stayed by his side, bathing his face, giving him sips of water. Sometime deep in the night, he woke. His eyes were lucid for a moment, and they focused on her. He tried to speak, but only a cough came out. He saw the dried tear tracks on her face, the raw pain in her eyes. He had heard her. He had heard it all. The weight of it settled on him, a crushing, impossible burden. He had stepped into something far darker than a simple snowstorm. This was not his fight. He was a drifter, a man running from his own ghosts. He could not take on hers as well. He would only fail her, just as he had failed Liam. The only honorable thing to do, the only safe thing for her, was for him to disappear. Before the first light, while she was dozing in a chair, he pulled himself to his feet. Every muscle screamed in protest. His head throbbed. His ribs were a band of fire. He stumbled out of the cabin and into the freezing pre-dawn air. He would take his saddle and walk. He would vanish before Malcolm returned. It was better this way. But as he stood there in the snow, the image of her face as she sewed his wound shut rose in his mind. He saw her standing between him and Malcolm's rifle. He heard her whispered confession. "I have never been touched with kindness, not until you." He could not do it. He could not leave her. To leave her now would be a betrayal worse than any failure on the battlefield. It would be leaving his brother to die all over again. He turned and went to the shed. Her horse, a scrawny but resilient mare, was sheltered there, with slow, painful movements. He threw a saddle on its back. He then retrieved his own saddle and rifle from where Malcolm had left them in the snow. As the sun began to cast a pale, watery light over the snow-covered peaks, he led the saddled horse to the cabin door. Elsie was awake. Standing just inside, she had seen him go, and her face was a mask of utter desolation. She thought he was leaving her. He stopped in front of her. He was a wreck of a man, bruised and bandaged, but his eyes were clear and his resolve was absolute. He had made his choice. "We ride at first light," he said, his voice raw but steady. "I am taking you out of here." There was no time for thought, no time for fear to take root. His words, "I am taking you out of here," were a spark in the tinder of her desperation. They moved in the gray, pre-dawn light, a silent, frantic scramble. Elsie threw her few meager belongings, a spare dress, her mother's tarnished silver locket, the sewing kit into a flour sack. Cole, moving with a stiff, pained deliberation that made her own ribs ache in sympathy, gathered his saddlebags, his rifle, and a thin canvas tarp. He said nothing more, his face a swollen, bruised mask of grim purpose. Leaving the cabin felt like shrugging off a tomb. She did not look back. The place was a monument to her misery, and she wanted to forget its very existence. Cole helped her onto the mare, his hands surprisingly gentle as he steadied her, and then he swung himself up onto his own recovered saddle, which he had strapped to the back of her horse. He would walk, leading the animal, to spare her the extra weight. It was a slow, agonizing pace. Every step was a fresh torment for him. She could see it in the tight clench of his jaw, the sweat that beaded on his brow despite the biting cold. They plunged into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The world was a blinding expanse of white, broken only by the dark, skeletal fingers of lodgepole pines. Cole did not take the trail Malcolm had used. He veered off into the deeper woods, following game trails that were little more than faint indentations in the snow. He was a man who knew the high country, who could read the land like a book. He was their compass, their only guide in a world that had erased all its landmarks. The first day was a blur of plodding exhaustion. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps, the creak of saddle leather, and the ragged sound of their own breathing. The cold was a constant, physical presence, a predator that stalked them relentlessly. By the time dusk began to bleed purple and gray through the trees, Elsie was swaying with fatigue, her body numb. Cole found them shelter in a shallow overhang of rock, a small indentation in the side of a hill that offered some protection from the wind. He built a small, smokeless fire, a skill he seemed to possess as naturally as breathing. He shared the last of his dried venison with her, 2 tough, leathery strips that she chewed until her jaw ached. It was the most satisfying meal of her life. That night, they slept on opposite sides of the fire, each wrapped in their own blanket. The canvas tarp stretched overhead, but the cold was a persistent enemy, creeping in from all sides. Elsie lay awake for hours, shivering, listening to the vast, lonely silence of the mountains and the soft, pained groans Cole made in his sleep. He was hurt worse than he let on. The next day was the same, and the day after. A slow, punishing trek through a world of white. Elsie's initial sliver of hope began to curdle into a dull, constant fear. They were fugitives. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig made her heart leap into her throat. Malcolm was out there somewhere. He would not simply let her go. She was his property. His rage would be a wildfire, and he would hunt them until he found them. At night, she began to tend to Cole's wounds. He would sit stoically, his shirt off in the frigid air, while she cleaned the gash on his side and the cut on his forehead with snowmelt and a precious bit of whiskey from his flask. Her stitches were clumsy, but they held. Her touch was hesitant, gentle. He never flinched, but she could feel the tension in his muscles, the rigid control he exerted over his own pain. He would not look at her during these ministrations, but she felt his gaze on her sometimes when she was gathering wood or staring out into the darkness. It was a heavy, watchful gaze, filled with a turmoil she could not begin to understand. On the fourth night, the temperature plummeted. The fire seemed to give off no heat, and the wind, which had been still for 2 days, began to whip through the trees with a low, mournful howl. Sleep was impossible. Elsie lay shivering, her teeth chattering, her body curled into a tight, desperate ball. After what felt like an eternity, she heard Cole move. He came around the fire and sat beside her, his own blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He did not speak. He just sat there, a solid, brooding presence in the dark. After a long moment, he took his blanket and draped it over her, on top of her own. "It is warmer with 2, he said, his voice a low rumble. He lay down beside her, on top of the blankets, his back to her, creating a barrier against the wind. The heat from his body was a distant promise, but it was not enough. The cold was too deep, too relentless. Without thinking, driven by a primal need for warmth and comfort, Elsie shifted closer. She hesitated for a second, then reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his arm. His muscles went rigid beneath her touch. She expected him to pull away, to retreat back into his solitary fortress of pain, but he did not. He remained perfectly still. Tentatively, she curled her fingers around his bicep, holding on as if he were an anchor in a storm. He was solid, real. He was warmth in a world of cold. After a long, silent moment, she felt the rigid tension in his arm relax, just a fraction. He was letting her hold on. They lay like that for the rest of the night, a silent, huddled knot of shared misery and fragile trust, and for the first time in a week, Elsie slept without dreaming. They traveled for 2 more days, a pattern of grueling effort by day and huddled, silent intimacy by night. Her hand on his arm became their ritual, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond that was growing between them, a bond forged in desperation and sustained by a quiet, mutual need. They were nearing the edge of the range, the trees beginning to thin, the promise of flatter, more open country ahead. A dangerous, foolish hope began to take root in Elsie's heart. Perhaps they had made it. Perhaps they were free. It was in a narrow, forested pass, the trees thick on either side, that their luck ran out. They came around a bend in the trail and found them waiting. 2 men on horseback, blocking the path. They were not bandits. They were solid, grim-faced men wearing the tin stars of deputy sheriffs. Their horses were fresh, their expressions weary but determined. Cole saw them first. He stopped so suddenly that Elsie, who was walking beside him, bumped into him. He put a hand out, a gesture for her to stay back, and his whole body became a statue of tense, wary stillness. "That is far enough," the lead deputy said. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. "We are looking for a man named Cole and a runaway girl named Elsie." Elsie's blood ran cold. The fragile hope in her chest shattered into a million pieces. "Malcolm, he had gone to the law." "There is some mistake," Cole said, his voice low and even. "My name is Cole. This is a young lady I found stranded. I am taking her to the nearest town for safety." The deputy sighed, a sound of weary patience. "Son, we got a wire 2 days ago from a rancher named Malcolm Tanner. Says his wife ran off, abducted by a drifter who near beat him to death. Now, you look pretty beat up yourself, but you fit the description. And so does she." He nodded toward Elsie. "I'm sorry, miss, but you will have to come with us." "No!" Elsie cried, stepping forward. "You do not understand. He is the one who is hurt. My husband, he—" "That will be for the sheriff to sort out," the second deputy said, cutting her off. He dismounted, a rope in his hand. "You, Cole, put your hands up where I can see them." Cole looked at Elsie. In his eyes, she saw a flash of a pain so deep it stole her breath. It was the look of a man who had tried to outrun his fate, only to find it waiting for him at the end of the road. It was the look of failure. He slowly raised his hands. The arrest was a quiet, humiliating affair. They took his rifle and his pistol. They bound his wrists in front of him. They put him on Elsie's mare and led the horse by a rope. Elsie was made to ride behind the lead deputy. She kept looking back at Cole, her heart breaking at the sight of his bowed head, his slumped shoulders. He looked like a man already in his grave. They rode for half a day, finally emerging from the mountains and into a small, wind-scoured town that clung to the side of a muddy river. It was a collection of unpainted wooden buildings, a single street thick with mud, and the curious, staring eyes of its inhabitants. They took Cole directly to the sheriff's office, a small building with barred windows that doubled as the town jail. Elsie watched in horror as they led him inside, the door closing behind him with a sound of finality. "What about her?" the second deputy asked. The lead deputy, whose name was Miller, looked at Elsie with a pained expression. "Mr. Tanner's wire said she is to be kept in a safe place until he can come for her. The women's boarding house. I suppose Mrs. Gable will look after her." The boarding house was a tall, stern-looking building at the end of the street, painted a severe shade of gray. Inside, it smelled of lye soap, boiled cabbage, and judgment. A woman emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on an apron. She was in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. This was Martha Gable. "Sheriff Brody wants you to keep an eye on this one," Deputy Miller said, his hand on Elsie's shoulder. "She is a runaway wife. Her husband is on his way." Mrs. Gable's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over Elsie, taking in her ragged dress, her tangled hair, her terrified expression. She did not look sympathetic. She looked weary, as if Elsie were just the latest in a long line of troubles to be deposited on her doorstep. "She can have the room at the back," the matron said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "The one with the latch on the outside. Dinner is at 6. She will not be leaving the house." Deputy Miller nodded, tipped his hat, and left. Elsie was alone with the formidable Mrs. Gable. She was led to a small, scrupulously clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a muddy alley. The door closed, and she heard the unmistakable sound of the latch falling into place. She was a prisoner again. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Brody came to question her. He was a thick-set man with a walrus mustache and tired, skeptical eyes. He sat on the room's only chair while Mrs. Gable stood by the door, her arms crossed. "Now, miss," the sheriff began, his voice a low rumble, "we need to get your side of the story. Your husband, Mr. Tanner, claims this man Cole came onto his property, assaulted him, and then abducted you against your will. Is that what happened?" Elsie stared at her hands, which were twisted together in her lap. The words were trapped in her throat. To speak the truth seemed impossible. Who would believe her? She was a runaway wife. Cole was a drifter. Malcolm was a landowner, a man of property. The world was built to believe men like Malcolm. "Miss," the sheriff prompted, his patience already wearing thin. "He did not abduct me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I went with him." The sheriff exchanged a look with Mrs. Gable. It was a look of weary confirmation. Another foolish young wife, seduced by a handsome stranger. "So you went with him willingly, after he attacked your husband?" "He did not attack him," she said, her voice rising with a frantic edge. "Malcolm attacked him. He was going to kill him. Malcolm, he—" She stopped. The words would not come. The image of Malcolm's face, contorted with rage, filled her mind. The memory of his hands on her, his voice in her ear, the long, terrifying nights. The shame was a physical thing, a gag in her throat. "He what, miss?" the sheriff asked, his voice softening slightly. "What did your husband do?" And then she broke. It was not a sudden crack, but a slow, agonizing crumble. The dam of silence and endurance she had built around herself for months finally gave way. A single tear slid down her cheek, then another. A sob escaped her, a raw, ragged sound of a pain too long held in. She wrapped her arms around herself and began to rock back and forth, the sobs coming faster now, shaking her entire body. "He left me," she choked out between gasps. "In the storm, no food. He said I had to learn obedience. Cole found me. He saved me. He kept me from freezing." The sheriff looked uncomfortable, out of his depth. He glanced at Mrs. Gable, who had not moved, but whose expression had changed. The stern, judgmental mask had fallen away, replaced by a look of sharp, focused attention. "He hurt me," Elsie whispered, the words coming out in a torrent now. A confession whispered into the stuffy air of the small room. "From the beginning, he said it was his right. He locked me in. There were bruises." The sheriff shifted in his chair. "Bruises can come from a lot of things on a ranch. Miss, a fall from a horse, a slip on the ice." "Not these bruises," a new voice said. It was Mrs. Gable. She had moved from the door and was kneeling in front of Elsie. Her voice was no longer crisp. It was low and steady. "Elsie, look at me." Elsie lifted her head, her vision blurred with tears. Mrs. Gable's face was close to hers. The granite had softened. In her eyes, Elsie saw not pity, but a fierce, profound understanding. "Show me," the matron said quietly, with trembling fingers. Elsie turned around, her back to the matron. She pulled up the back of her dress, her skin flinching at the touch of the cold air. The room was silent. She could feel the sheriff's awkward presence behind her, the weight of Mrs. Gable's gaze on her skin. "Dear Lord," Mrs. Gable breathed. Elsie's back was a roadmap of Malcolm's cruelty. Faded yellow and purple marks mingled with the newer, angrier bruises from the fight. There were the distinct, repeating shapes of a belt buckle across her shoulders. "I reckon a horse did not do that," Mrs. Gable said, her voice cold with a fury that was far more terrifying than the sheriff's bluster. She gently pulled Elsie's dress back down and turned to face the sheriff, her eyes blazing. "Well, Brody, what do you say now?" The sheriff cleared his throat, his face flushed. He was a man of the law, and the law was clear about the sanctity of a marriage. But the evidence on the girl's back was also clear. He was silent for a long moment. "I will have the doctor take a look," he said finally, his voice gruff. "But her husband is a man of standing. It is her word against his." He left the room, leaving the two women alone. A quiet kindness, born of a shared and terrible understanding, began to bloom in the silence. Mrs. Gable fetched a cup of hot tea and a warm, clean nightgown. She helped Elsie wash her face and brush the tangles from her hair. She did not ask any more questions. She did not need to. Later that evening, as she brought Elsie a bowl of stew, she paused at the door. "I was a runaway bride once myself, dear," she said softly, her gaze distant. From a man who thought a marriage license was a bill of sale. It is a hard road, but you are not alone on it. Meanwhile, in a cold, damp cell just down the street, Cole sat on a hard cot, his head in his hands. His body ached, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his soul. He had tried to save her, and instead, he had led her right into a cage. They had questioned him, but he had refused to speak. There was nothing he could say that would not make it worse for her. To speak of Malcolm's cruelty would be to shame her publicly. To claim he was rescuing her would only confirm the charge of abduction. His silence was the only thing he had left to give her, a final, desperate attempt to protect her honor, even at the cost of his own freedom. He would take the blame. He would hang, if it came to it. It was no more than he deserved. He had failed again. He sat that way for hours, bruised and silent in the dark, a man who had accepted his fate. He did not look up when he heard the key in the lock, the creak of the cell door. He did not move until he heard her voice, a voice that was no longer crisp and businesslike, but low and determined. "Mr. Cole," said Martha Gable. He slowly raised his head. She stood in the doorway, a lantern held aloft, her shadow long and stark against the stone wall. "I have just come from seeing Elsie," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "She has told me everything." Cole said nothing, his face a mask of stone. "You are a fool if you think your silence is helping her," the matron continued, her voice sharp. "Right now, it is her word against her husband's. A judge will send her back before the week is out. Your silence is a confession, and it will be her damnation." He still did not speak. His failure was a bitter taste in his mouth. "Mrs." Gable took a step closer, her expression softening. "She is a fighter, that one, stronger than she knows, but she is frightened, and she is asking for you." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. "She is asking for you." It was not a plea for rescue. It was a plea for him to stand with her. It was a plea for him not to abandon her in the final, desperate battle. It was a plea for him to believe her, to be her witness. It was, he realized, the first time in his life that someone had truly needed him, not just his strength or his gun, but him. He looked up at the matron, and for the first time since the deputies had found them in the pass, a flicker of something other than despair stirred in his weary eyes. The hearing was not held in a proper courthouse, but in the town's meeting hall, a large, drafty room that smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool. Nearly the entire town had turned out, their face a sea of grim curiosity. They crammed onto rough-hewn benches, the men on one side, the women on the other, a silent, judgmental choir ready to witness the small, ugly drama unfold. Elsie sat on a hard chair beside Martha Gable, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Mrs. Gable had helped her dress in a simple, dark blue garment borrowed from the boarding house's charity box. It was clean and mended, and it made her feel less like a wild, runaway creature and more like a person. The matron's presence beside her was a solid, reassuring warmth, a silent promise that she was not alone. Cole was brought in by Deputy Miller. He was not in chains, but the deputy's hand rested near his pistol, a clear statement of his status. Cole's face was still a patchwork of bruises. The stitches Elsie had made a crude, dark line on his forehead. He looked tired and worn, but as he was led to a chair across the room, his eyes found Elsie's. He held her gaze for only a second, but in that brief glance, she saw a universe of regret and a fierce, protective resolve. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and it was enough. It was his way of telling her he was with her. Then Malcolm arrived. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a dark suit that strained at his broad shoulders. His face was clean-shaven, his hair slicked down with pomade. The bruise from Elsie's log was a faint yellow mark on his shoulder, easily missed. He walked with a confident swagger, nodding to a few of the men on the benches, playing the part of the wronged husband. the respectable landowner beset by trouble. He sat beside his lawyer, a sour-faced man from a larger town, and pointedly ignored Elsie's existence. The hearing was presided over by a traveling circuit judge, an old man named Harrison with a weary face and eyes that had seen every kind of human misery. He called the room to order with a bang of his gavel, and the proceedings began. Malcolm was called to testify first. He walked to the stand with a practiced air of solemn injury. His lawyer led him through his story, a carefully constructed fiction that was all the more poisonous for its calm, reasonable delivery. "Mr. Tanner," the lawyer began, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "could you please tell the court about the events leading to your wife's departure?" Malcolm cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the jury of townspeople. "I had to be away from the ranch for a time, on business. It was unexpected. I left my wife, Elsie, well provided for. When I returned, I found my home in disarray, and this drifter," he gestured toward Cole, his voice dripping with contempt, "had taken up residence. He had been there for days." "And what was your wife's state, Mr. Tanner?" "She was not herself," Malcolm said, shaking his head with a look of profound pity. "Elsie is a simple girl, frail of mind, you might say, prone to delusions. This man, Cole, he is a smooth talker. He filled her head with fantasies, turned her against me, her lawfully wedded husband." A low murmur went through the men's side of the room. They knew men like Cole, drifters who came and went, who had no stake in the community. They were a dangerous, unpredictable element. "And when you confronted this man," the lawyer prompted. "I asked him to leave my property, politely," Malcolm said, the lie rolling easily off his tongue. "He refused. He became violent. He attacked me with an axe. I was forced to defend myself. In the confusion, he convinced my poor, confused wife to flee with him. He abducted her. I was injured, but my only thought was for her safety. He had painted a masterpiece of deceit. He was the victim. Cole was the villain. Elsie was the witless pawn." To many in the room, it was a familiar story, a plausible one. Elsie felt a wave of nausea. His words were a cage, and he was locking her inside it, bar by heavy bar. "That is all, Your Honor," the lawyer said, sitting down with a satisfied smirk. "The court calls Elsie Tanner," Judge Harrison said, his voice flat. Martha Gable squeezed Elsie's arm. "Just the truth, dear," she whispered. "Look at the judge and speak the truth." Elsie felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she walked to the stand. Her legs were trembling, and she had to grip the railing to steady herself. She sat down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The judge looked at her, his expression not unkind. "Now, Mrs. Tanner, you have heard your husband's testimony. Is it true? Did this man Cole seduce you and abduct you against your will?" Elsie took a deep, shuddering breath. She remembered the cold. She remembered the hunger. She remembered Cole's quiet competence, the warmth of his body next to hers in the dark. She looked at the judge, her voice so quiet at first that he had to lean forward to hear her. "No, sir, that is not true." Her voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by the terrible, burning power of her truth. "My husband, Mr. Tanner, he left me. He left me alone in the cabin, in a blizzard. He took most of the food and all of the wood. He said I was to think about obedience." Another murmur rippled through the room, this one from the women's side. They knew what a blizzard in the high country meant. They knew what it was to be left alone. "I was alone for 5 days, she continued, her voice trembling but clear. "The food ran out. The fire went out. I was freezing. I thought I was going to die. Then Cole came. His horse had collapsed in the storm. He was half frozen himself. I let him in." She looked over at Malcolm, who was staring at her with eyes full of cold fury. For the first time, she did not flinch. "Cole saved my life," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "He chopped wood. He hunted for food. He patched the roof. He did not seduce me. He barely spoke to me. He was just kind." The word hung in the air, a foreign concept in the context of her life with Malcolm. "And the fight?" the judge asked gently. "What happened when your husband returned?" "Mr. Tanner was drunk," Elsie said, her voice dropping. "He was angry. He accused me of things. He said he was going to kill us both. He raised his rifle. Cole stopped him. Mr. Tanner attacked Cole. He beat him. He was going to kill him. I hit Mr. Tanner with a log to make him stop." Malcolm's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! The girl is clearly hysterical. She is confessing to assaulting her own husband." "Sit down. Counsel," the judge said, his eyes still fixed on Elsie. He had seen enough hysterical women in his time to know that this was not one of them. This was something else. This was truth, raw and unadorned. "You claim your husband was cruel to you. Mrs. Tanner, do you have any proof of this?" This was the moment. Elsie's courage wavered. To do this in front of the whole town was a violation, a shame beyond imagining. She looked at Mrs. Gable, who gave her a firm, resolute nod. She looked at Cole, who was watching her with an expression of profound, aching sorrow. He did not want her to have to do this, but he knew she must. With trembling fingers, Elsie stood. She turned her back to the judge in the silent, watching room. She fumbled with the buttons at the nape of her neck, her fingers clumsy with fear. "Mrs." Gable rose and came to her side, her hands firm and steady as she unfastened the top of the dress. She pulled the fabric down, exposing Elsie's back and shoulders. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a sharp, indrawn breath, a sound of shared horror. The faded, ugly marks of Malcolm's belt were a clear, undeniable testament, a secret history now laid bare for all to see. "That is enough, child," the judge said, his voice thick with a new emotion. It was anger. "You may cover yourself." "Mrs." Gable gently buttoned the dress, her touch a comfort and a shield. Elsie sat down, her face burning with shame, but her heart was strangely light. The secret was out. The monster was no longer hiding in the shadows. The doctor was called next. He was a small, fussy man with spectacles, and he testified in a dry, clinical tone that the bruises on Elsie's back were of various ages, and that their shape was consistent not with any accidental fall, but with repeated blows from a belt or a strap. Then Martha Gable took the stand. She spoke in a clear, firm voice, her gaze sweeping over the women of the town, a silent call for solidarity. She spoke of the state Elsie had been in when she arrived, of her terror, of the girl's quiet dignity. "I have seen frightened girls before, Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "But this was not just fear. This was the terror of an animal that has been caged and beaten its entire life. I know that terror when I see it." Sheriff Brody was the last to testify before Cole. He was a changed man. His skepticism was gone, replaced by a grim certainty. He recounted the arrest, and then he looked directly at Malcolm. "When I questioned Mr. Tanner about his injuries," the sheriff said, his voice a low growl, "he claimed he had been set upon by a wild animal. After seeing his wife's back, I am beginning to think he was telling the truth." The tide had turned. The whispers in the room were no longer of a foolish, runaway wife, but of a brutal husband. The men who had nodded in agreement with Malcolm now shifted uncomfortably on the benches, avoiding his gaze. Finally, the judge called for Cole. He walked to the stand, his limp more pronounced than ever. He looked broken, but his eyes were clear. He swore the oath, his voice low but steady. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Cole, you have put yourself in a great deal of trouble. You stand accused of abduction and assault. What do you have to say for yourself?" Cole looked not at the judge, but at Elsie. He saw her small, pale face, the courage that had cost her so much. The words he spoke were not for the court, or for the town. They were for her. "I found her alone, sir, starving," he said, his voice raw. "I did what any man would do. I kept her from freezing. When her husband returned, he tried to kill us both. I fought to protect her. That is the whole truth of it." "And your intentions toward this young woman?" Malcolm's lawyer sneered, rising to his feet. "You expect this court to believe you, a common drifter, felt nothing for this vulnerable, lonely girl?" Cole turned his head and looked at the lawyer, his eyes suddenly blazing with a cold, hard light that made the other man take an involuntary step back. "I never touched her," Cole said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "Not in the way you mean." He paused, and his gaze shifted back to Elsie, a look of fierce, unwavering devotion. "But I would kill 100 men to keep her safe." The declaration, so raw and absolute, hung in the air. It was not a defense. It was a vow. The women on their benches looked from Cole's battered face to Elsie's tear-streaked one, and they understood. They began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in a quiet but powerful chorus of support. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "The court will recess while I consider my verdict." The room erupted into a buzz of conversation as people began to file out into the muddy street. Malcolm, his face purple with rage, shoved his way through the crowd. His authority, his reputation, his very manhood had been challenged and found wanting in a public forum. He was a man unhinged. He saw Elsie standing with Mrs. Gable near the door. "You!" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. He lunged for her, his hands outstretched like claws. "You will pay for this. You are my wife. You belong to me." Elsie cried out and stumbled backward, but Cole was already there. He moved with a speed that defied his injuries, placing himself directly in Malcolm's path. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood there, a battered, immovable wall between Elsie and the man who had tormented her. "Get out of my way!" Malcolm snarled, and he swung a wild punch. Cole took the blow on the shoulder, staggering but not falling. He grabbed Malcolm's arms, holding on, absorbing the larger man's furious struggles. It was not a fight. It was a containment. Sheriff Brody and his deputy were there in an instant. They grabbed Malcolm, who was still shouting threats and curses, and wrestled his arms behind his back. "Malcolm Tanner," the sheriff said, his voice ringing with satisfaction as he snapped a pair of iron cuffs onto Malcolm's wrists. "You are under arrest for assault, and this time there are witnesses." They hauled him away, still raging, a pathetic, defeated bully. The crowd watched in stunned silence, and then a few of the women began to clap. An hour later, the verdict was delivered. Judge Harrison, his face grim, declared the marriage of Elsie and Malcolm Tanner null and void, citing the clear and overwhelming evidence of cruelty and abuse. He ordered Malcolm to be held in jail pending a trial for his assault on Cole and his treatment of Elsie. And he declared Cole a free man. Cole was released from a side door of the jail. His few belongings returned to him in a sack. He stood in the alleyway, the cold afternoon sun on his face, but he felt no relief. He was free, but he was also tainted. He was a man who had brought nothing but violence and trouble. He had been in a brawl. He had been in jail. He was a drifter with a past full of ghosts. Elsie was free now. She had Mrs. Gable. She had the sympathy of the town. She had a chance to build a life, a clean, respectable life. She did not need a man like him dragging her down. A constant reminder of the ugliest chapter of her life. The kindest thing he could do, the only honorable thing, was to disappear. That night, Elsie found him in the town's livery stable. He had bought back his saddle and was packing his things, preparing to leave on a horse he had purchased with the last of his money. The stable was quiet, filled with the warm, earthy smell of hay and horses. He did not hear her approach. He was bent over his saddlebags, his movements slow and deliberate. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. He straightened up slowly and turned to face her. In the dim lantern light, his face was a roadmap of shadows and pain. "It is better this way, Elsie." "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She took a step closer. "Do not go." He shook his head, a look of profound sadness in his eyes. He looked down at his own bruised and battered hands. "I am not the right man for you. A girl like you. You deserve a fresh start, a good man, not someone like me. I was never good enough for you." The words were a blade in her heart. He did not understand. He thought he was saving her again, by leaving her. He thought he was unworthy. She closed the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up into his tired, haunted eyes. "When I was with him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I was not a person. I was a thing. I was a ghost. I was not real." She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, solid beat beneath her palm. "But you," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "You are the only one who ever made me feel real." His words hung in the warm, hay-scented air of the stable, a final, insurmountable wall between them. "I was never good enough for you." He believed it. Elsie could see the conviction in the deep, weary lines of his face. He saw himself as a blight, a walking storm of trouble and grief, and he was trying to save her by riding out of her life, a final, painful act of kindness. He thought it was what she needed, to be scrubbed clean of the past, and he was the deepest stain. But as she stood there, her hand still resting over the steady, solid beat of his heart, she knew he was wrong. He was not her past. He was the only thing that had ever felt like a future. Before she could find the words to tell him this, he gently took her hand from his chest, his calloused fingers lingering on hers for a single, heartbreaking second. He turned away from her then, busying himself with a cinch on his new horse, a silent, final dismissal. The conversation was over. His mind was made up. He would ride out with the dawn. Elsie stood for a long moment, watching his rigid, retreating back. She did not plead. She did not cry. Something inside her, a new and fragile thing that had been born in the fire of the hearing, had solidified into a quiet resolve. Begging was for the desperate and the powerless, and she was no longer either of those things. She turned and walked out of the stable, her steps steady, leaving him alone with his honor and his ghosts. Cole rode out the next morning, just as the sun was turning the eastern peaks the color of a fresh bruise. He did not look toward the boarding house. He kept his eyes fixed on the high country, the rugged, unforgiving wilderness that had always been his only true home. He was doing the right thing. It was a conviction that felt as cold and heavy as a stone in his gut. Elsie's new life began in the quiet, orderly rooms of Martha Gable's boarding house. The weeks that followed were a strange, calm dream after the nightmare of her marriage and the frantic desperation of her flight. She fell into the rhythm of the house, a life dictated by the rising of the sun, the scent of baking bread, the steady, no-nonsense kindness of the matron. She swept floors, kneaded dough, and mended linens, her hands finding a new kind of peace in simple, honest work. The women of the town, who had once looked upon her with suspicion, now greeted her with quiet nods of respect, and sometimes a shared, knowing glance of solidarity. They had seen her back. They had heard her truth. She was one of them now. But the biggest change happened in the evenings. In the parlor, under the soft glow of an oil lamp, Mrs. Gable, seeing the hungry intelligence in Elsie's eyes, began to teach her how to read. At first, the letters were just meaningless black squiggles on a page, a secret code she could not decipher. Her fingers, clumsy and unaccustomed to the delicate task, struggled to form the shapes on a slate. But Mrs. Gable was a patient teacher, and Elsie was a determined student. The alphabet was a mountain she conquered one letter at a time. The first word she learned to write was her own name, Lsie. She stared at it, this tangible proof of her own existence, and felt a thrill of power that was more potent than any food, any warmth. Soon, words became sentences, and sentences became stories. The world, which had always been a small, terrifying place bounded by the walls of a cabin, began to open up. She read from the Bible, from old newspapers, from a tattered copy of a penny dreadful that one of the other boarders had left behind. Each new word was a brick in the foundation of a new self, a self that was not defined by Malcolm's cruelty or her father's desperation. And then the letters began to arrive. The first one came 6 weeks after Cole had left. The postmaster handed it to her, his expression curious. It was a single folded sheet of paper in a plain envelope, addressed in a rough, blocky script to Elsie, care of Mrs. Gable. There was no return address. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she took it to her room and opened it with trembling fingers. The letter was short, the handwriting as rough as the man who had penned it. The snow is melting on the south slopes. I saw a hawk today, riding the wind. It made me think of you. That was all. There was no greeting, no closing, just his name, Cole, printed at the bottom. She read the words a dozen times, her fingers tracing the shape of the letters. It was him. He was alive. He was thinking of her. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside her mother's locket, wearing it against her skin. A secret, precious treasure. The letters came every few weeks after that. They were never long. They were like small, polished stones he had picked up along his way and sent to her. He wrote of the world he saw, the high, lonely country that was his sanctuary. I fixed a line cabin that was falling in. The roof is tight now. It is quiet here. The stars are so bright they feel close enough to touch. Another time, the creek is running high with meltwater. I found a vein of gold color in the quartz, but I think it is just fool's gold. It is pretty, though. He never wrote of his feelings. He never mentioned the past, or the hearing, or Malcolm, who had been sentenced to 2 years in the territorial prison. He never asked her to write back, for he had given her no address. The letters were a one-way correspondence, a series of dispatches from a man who was determined to remain a ghost in her life, but who could not quite bring himself to disappear completely. Elsie treasured each one. They were her lifeline to the man who had made her feel real. With each letter, the image of his battered, bruised face in the stable began to fade, replaced by the man she knew he was. Quiet, competent, and with a poet's heart that he kept hidden from the world. Months passed. The last of the snow vanished from the high peaks. The muddy streets of the town dried out, and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the hard soil. Elsie's reading improved until she could decipher the newspaper on her own. Her face filled out, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She was no longer the broken, terrified girl who had stumbled into town. She was a young woman, standing on her own 2 feet, but her heart remained in the high country, with a man who wrote of hawks and stars. One afternoon in late April, the last letter arrived. It was shorter than all the others. When she unfolded the paper, she found only a single sentence, written in his familiar, rough script. I built a cabin, and it has got 2 chairs. Elsie stared at the words, her breath caught in her throat. It was not a question. It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact, a quiet offering. It was the most beautiful, hopeful sentence she had ever read. He had not asked her to come. He had not presumed to know what she wanted. He had simply built a place for her, and he was leaving the choice entirely, completely, up to her. Her decision was made before she even folded the letter. It was a choice that came not from desperation or need, but from a deep, certain knowledge of her own heart. She told Mrs. Gable that evening. The matron listened, her expression unreadable. As Elsie explained, When she was finished, Mrs. Gable was silent for a long moment. "He is a good man, I think," the matron said finally. "But a haunted one. It will not be an easy life." "I do not want an easy life," Elsie said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want a real one." Mrs. Gable looked at the young woman before her, at the strength in her eyes, the set of her jaw. This was not the frightened child who had collapsed in tears just a few months ago. This was a woman who knew her own mind. The matron nodded slowly, a rare, small smile touching her lips. "Then you had best get packing. The high country does not wait for anyone." She rode out 2 days later, on the same scrawny mare that had carried her to freedom. Mrs. Gable had packed her a bag with food, a new, warm blanket, and a small book of poems. The whole town seemed to turn out to see her off, the women wishing her well, the men tipping their hats with a newfound respect. The trail was long. The letters had given her a general direction, north into the Wind River Range, past a landmark known as the Sleeping Giant. For days, she rode alone, the vast, empty landscape a stark reminder of her own smallness. But this time, she was not afraid. The wilderness was no longer an enemy. It was just a place that held the man she was seeking. On the 4th day, the weather turned. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hopeful blue, turned to a leaden gray. A cold wind began to blow down from the peaks, carrying with it the sharp, biting scent of snow. She was caught in a late spring storm, a final, treacherous test from the mountains. The snow began to fall, thick and wet, obscuring the trail, turning the world into a churning white chaos. For a moment, panic seized her. The cold, the blinding snow, it was the cabin all over again. But then she remembered Cole's face, his quiet strength. She remembered his letter. "I built a cabin." She was not running from something anymore. She was riding toward it. She bent her head against the wind, her resolve hardening into a stubborn, unwavering line, and urged the mare forward. She rode for what felt like an eternity, her body numb, her hope beginning to fray. Just as dusk was settling, and she was beginning to fear she would have to spend the night in the storm, she saw it, through a gap in the swirling snow. A faint, flickering pinpoint of orange light, a lamp in a window. She followed the light, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The trail led her up a gentle ridge, and there it was, a small log cabin, tucked into a grove of aspen trees. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a warm, welcoming plume against the gray sky. And on the porch, sitting in one of 2 simply made wooden chairs, was a man. He stood as she approached, the snow swirling around her. He was no longer the battered, bruised man she had last seen. He was leaner, harder, his skin weathered by the sun and wind, but his eyes were the same, filled with a deep, aching loneliness that was now at war with a dawning, incredulous hope. The world seemed to fall silent. There was only the soft hiss of the falling snow and the frantic, unvoiced questions that passed between their eyes. She slid from the mare's back, her legs unsteady, and took a tentative step toward him. He met her halfway. They did not speak. Words were too small for the moment. He reached out and gently brushed a snowflake from her cheek, his calloused fingers incredibly soft against her cold skin. A tear escaped her eye, and he wiped it away. She raised a trembling hand and touched the faint scar on his jaw, the one she had touched once before, a lifetime ago. He closed his eyes at her touch, a shudder passing through him. The months of loneliness, of honor, of quiet, aching grief, all came undone in that single, silent touch. He took her hand and led her inside. The cabin was one room, clean and simple. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the log walls. A sturdy table, a bed covered with a thick fur pelt, and a shelf of books filled the space. It was a place built for 2, a place built for them. It was a home. That night, After they had eaten a simple meal of rabbit stew and she had thawed by the fire, a nervous, trembling silence fell between them. This was the precipice. Everything that had come before, the storm, the violence, the letters, had led them to this single, quiet moment. This was no longer about survival. This was about choice. She stood by the fire, her back to him, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. She could feel his presence behind her, the weight of all the things they had never said. She felt him move closer, his warmth a familiar comfort at her back. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray strand of hair back from her face. His touch was a question. "Elsie," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. May I kiss you?" His asking, his simple, profound respect for her, was the greatest gift he could have ever given her. It healed a wound inside her that she did not even know was still bleeding. She turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at his face, at this quiet, haunted, honorable man who had seen the very worst of her and had still built a place for her in his world. The old words, once a plea of a terrified child, rose to her lips, but now they were a woman's question, an offering of her whole heart. "If I beg, will you stay?" she asked, her voice a breathless whisper. A slow smile spread across his face, a beautiful, breaking dawn that chased away the last of the shadows in his eyes. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "Only if you let me stay forever," he answered. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was slow and gentle and real. It was a promise made and a promise kept. And as the fire crackled in the hearth and the late spring snow blanketed the world outside in a clean, quiet peace, the shadows that had followed them for so long finally began to fade with the rising sun. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.